The ballroom was filled with polished shoes, tailored suits, and carefully rehearsed smiles. This wasn't a concert hall. This was a high-level corporate charity gala, the kind where power was measured in net worth, not applause. Crystal glasses clinked as executives laughed a little too loudly, making sure the right people noticed them. At the center of it all stood a well-known CEO, confident, sharp-eyed, moving through the room like she owned it. Every handshake she gave was deliberate. Every smile was calculated. Then Ozzy Osbourne walked in. No leather jacket, no sunglasses, no entourage screaming his name. Just a simple dark blazer, slightly worn boots, and a calm expression that didn't beg for attention. To most people in the room, he looked ordinary. As Ozzy was introduced in a small group circle, conversations briefly paused. The CEO turned toward him, scanned him from head to toe, not rudely, but dismissively. The kind of look that decides your value in 2 seconds. Ozzy smiled politely and extended his hand. She didn't take it. For half a second, it seemed like she hadn't noticed. Then she shifted her body slightly, turned away, and continued talking to the executive beside her as if Ozzy wasn't there. The air changed. A few people glanced down. One man cleared his throat. Another woman looked at Ozzy, then at the CEO, unsure what to do. Ozzy's hand hovered for a moment longer, not shaking, not awkward, just waiting. Then he calmly lowered it. No reaction, no comment, no embarrassment on his face. If anything, he looked amused. The CEO kept talking about quarterly growth and brand alignment, laughing softly at her own jokes. To her, Ozzy was background noise, someone who didn't meet her standards, whatever those were. But what she didn't realize was this. Several people in that circle knew exactly who he was. They were watching closely, not to see how she would act, but to see how he would respond. Ozzy nodded politely, stepped back, and let the conversation move on without him. No confrontation, no correction, no ego, and in that moment the CEO felt victorious, convinced she had just dismissed someone insignificant. She had no idea that the quiet man she refused to acknowledge was about to become the most powerful presence in the room. And by the next day, she would desperately wish she had shaken his hand. The conversation didn't stop after the snub, it shifted. The CEO leaned slightly closer to the other executives, her body language closing the circle without saying a word. Ozzy was no longer included. He stood just outside the group now, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be ignored. No one asked him a question. No one made space for him. It was subtle, clean, polite, and deliberate. The CEO continued speaking with confidence, listing recent acquisitions, expansion plans, and the kind of people she preferred to work with. Her words weren't openly rude, but the message was clear. She valued polish, image, control. Ozzy listened quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct her, didn't reinsert himself into the conversation. To her, that silence confirmed everything she assumed. She glanced at him once more, quick, shallow, and then turned back to the group. In her mind, he was already categorized, irrelevant, out of place, not worth a second handshake. Nearby, a younger executive shifted uncomfortably. He knew who Ozzy was. So did a woman holding a champagne glass who kept darting her eyes between the two. Phones stayed in pockets, but attention sharpened. This wasn't just about a handshake anymore. It was about judgment. The CEO laughed softly and said, "Events like these attract all kinds of people." Her tone smooth, harmless on the surface. But the timing was too perfect. The implication landed. Ozzy smiled again, smaller this time, and nodded as if he agreed. That reaction confused her. People who were dismissed usually tried to reclaim attention. They interrupted. They explained themselves. They forced relevance. Ozzy did none of that. Instead, he took a slow sip of water, glanced around the room, and observed. He noticed how people performed status, the way laughter rose and fell depending on who was speaking, how hands tightened around glasses when power walked by. He'd seen this before. Not in boardrooms, but in dressing rooms, record labels, and back halls where decisions were made before the music ever played. The CEO kept talking. The group responded on cue, but the energy was off. Someone asked a question and received a distracted answer. Another executive checked his watch. The woman with the champagne glass took a small step away, eyes lingering on Ozzy as if waiting for something to happen. Still, Ozzy remained silent. That silence began to work against the CEO. What she thought was confidence now felt like overcompensation. What she assumed was dominance started to feel like insecurity, the kind that needs someone else to be small. Finally, Ozzy excused himself politely and stepped aside, giving the group exactly what they seemed to want. Space. The CEO didn't look back. She was certain she had made the right call. What she didn't realize was this: in rooms like this, people don't judge character by who speaks the loudest. They judge it by who doesn't need to. And as Ozzy blended into the background, several people quietly began reassessing her, not him. Because power that has to announce itself usually isn't power at all. The gala moved on, but the imbalance lingered. Across the room, the CEO stood near a cluster of board members. Her posture relaxed now, confidence fully restored. She laughed easily, gesturing with her glass as she spoke about influence, leverage, and knowing who belongs in which rooms. Heads nodded. Compliments followed. Approval circulated like currency. On the opposite side, Ozzy Osbourne leaned against a high table near the windows, unnoticed by most, unbothered by all. He wasn't sulking. He wasn't waiting. He simply existed, calm, observant, detached from the performance unfolding around him. That contrast was the divide. The CEO power was loud. Ozzy's was quiet. She spoke in numbers, projections, and titles, dropping names like credentials. Each sentence was polished to signal relevance. The more she talked, the more she seemed to fill the space, as if silence might expose something she didn't want seen. Ozzy watched the rhythm of it. He noticed how conversations bent toward her when she raised her voice and flattened when she moved on. He noticed how people mirrored her laughter, even when the joke didn't land. He noticed how respect here wasn't earned, it was negotiated. A junior executive approached Ozzy briefly, offering a polite nod and a few careful words. Nothing more. The message was clear. I know who you are, but I don't want to be seen knowing. Ozzy returned the nod unfazed. The CEO glanced over and caught that exchange. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, irritation, maybe, or curiosity. She turned back to her group and spoke a little louder, reinforcing her presence, reclaiming attention. That's when she made the mistake. Well, she said with a confident smile, not everyone here understands what real influence looks like. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, which made it worse. A few people shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The words hung in the air, sharp enough to cut but vague enough to deny. Ozzy heard it. He didn't react. That lack of reaction unsettled her more than confrontation ever could. People who feel superior expect resistance, anger, embarrassment, explanation. Silence denies them all of it. Silence forces reflection, and reflection is dangerous in rooms built on illusion. Ozzy finished his water and stepped toward the exit of the ballroom, not to leave, but to breathe. From there, he could see the entire room, the clusters of power, the shifting alliances, the unspoken hierarchy. He had spent decades in places just like this, dressed differently, labeled differently, underestimated differently. The faces changed, the behavior didn't. Behind him, the CEO continued her performance, unaware that attention was slowly drifting. A board member checked his phone. An investor leaned away. The energy she controlled so tightly began to slip through her fingers. Not because of Ozzy's fame, but because of his restraint. Power doesn't always announce itself with dominance. Sometimes it exposes itself by refusing to compete. As the evening wore on, quiet conversations began forming on the edges, not about quarterly earnings, but about him. About who he was, about how he handled himself, about the handshake that never happened. The CEO sensed the shift but misread it. She assumed people were impressed by her confidence, her certainty, her command of the room. She didn't realize the room was measuring something else now. Not status, not titles, character. And while she stood at the center, speaking louder to maintain control, the true divide became clear to anyone paying attention. One person needed the room to feel powerful. The other didn't need anything at all. That was the moment the balance quietly began to tilt, and the CEO, still smiling, had no idea she was already losing. Who do you think has real power? The loud person or the calm one?
The key is scalability and user adoption.
But what about the implementation timeline?
We can adapt it quickly.
I'm listening.
Hours passed, yet the gala's rhythm remained tense. The CEO, confident and composed, continued her performance. Her laughter was measured, her gestures precise, her words polished to perfection. Around her, people nodded and murmured agreements. To anyone watching, she was untouchable. But somewhere along the edges of the room, whispers began to stir. A few executives, speaking in hushed tones to one another, glanced discreetly toward Ozzy Osbourne. "He's really him, isn't he?" One of them muttered, voice just loud enough for a nearby colleague to catch. "Legendary," came the reply, "global influence, brand power beyond anything in this room." The words reached the CEO ears, but she didn't acknowledge them at first. She continued speaking, describing the next quarter's projections and her company's strategic plans. To her, Ozzy was still just a guest, someone amusing to ignore. Then a few more murmurs filtered through the room. "You know, that's Ozzy Osbourne," a woman whispered, barely audible over the clinking of glasses. "He's the Black Sabbath frontman, millions of fans worldwide, and he has serious influence outside music too." The CEO head tilted slightly, almost imperceptibly. She laughed at one of her own jokes, but the sound was tighter than usual, less confident. Something in the energy of the room had shifted, and she couldn't immediately identify it. She scanned the edges, saw the occasional glance pointed at him, the subtle nods, the slight deference in how others spoke about him. Her confidence, which had seemed absolute just moments ago, began to feel brittle. In that moment, the first flicker of uncertainty appeared. She had assumed she knew the hierarchy of power in this room. Titles, accomplishments, financial influence, these were her metrics. But Ozzy Osbourne had never conformed to her system. He didn't need validation. He didn't assert dominance. He simply existed, and the room's respect for him grew quietly, almost invisibly. The CEO tried to maintain composure. She straightened her back, smiled, gestured emphatically. Yet with every whispered acknowledgement of Ozzy's legacy, a creeping tension formed. Executives she had assumed were fully under her sway now seemed divided. Some turned their attention, subtly, to him. Some asked questions in hushed tones, seeking his perspective, curious about his opinion. She realized slowly that her previous dismissal, the handshake she had refused, wasn't just noticed. It was being remembered. And in the kind of room where influence mattered, memory mattered more than ego. For the first time that evening, a hint of panic entered her expression, though she masked it expertly. Her mind raced. How much does he know about the companies in this room? What connections does he have? How quickly can he sway opinion? The murmurs continued, quietly gaining momentum. Conversations that had once orbited her confidence began to bend toward him. No one said it out loud yet, but the pattern was clear. Attention was shifting. She tried to reclaim dominance, but it felt reactive. Every joke landed a little flat. Every nod of agreement seemed delayed. The room, for the first time that evening, was not fully hers. Ozzy, meanwhile, remained calm. He didn't gloat. He didn't correct anyone. He simply observed, letting his quiet presence speak louder than any declaration. His restraint amplified his power, and in that quiet observation, the CEO experienced a moment of truth. The realization was subtle but undeniable. Her dismissal had been a miscalculation, and the very room she had controlled was beginning to acknowledge him in ways she couldn't easily command. The whispers, the glances, the silent recalibration of attention, it all painted the same picture. She had underestimated him, and now the quiet realization of that mistake began to spread through the room, invisible to most, but absolutely clear to her. By the end of the evening, the seed of doubt had been planted, and in the silence of her own thoughts, the CEO understood that the power divide, the one she had believed she controlled, was no longer hers to command. The following morning, the CEO awoke to a subtle but growing sense of unease. Last night's gala replayed in her mind. The handshake she had refused, the quiet way Ozzy Osbourne had stepped aside, the murmurs she had tried to dismiss. She told herself it didn't matter after all. She was powerful, respected, and in control. But deep down, a knot of doubt had formed. By mid-morning, it became impossible to ignore. Her inbox was flooded not with work-related emails, but with messages from her staff, assistants, and even board members. Subject lines were innocuous. Regarding last night, follow up from the gala, important, Ozzy Osbourne. Her heart sank. She opened the first message, CEO, just to clarify, the guest you dismissed last night is Ozzy Osbourne. Global brand influence, millions of fans, numerous corporate partnerships. He also had connections with several key investors attending our gala. She blinked. The words felt heavy, almost surreal. Ozzy Osbourne? The Ozzy Osbourne? The rock legend, the cultural icon, the man whose name alone could sway opinions in music, business, and beyond. Her mind raced. The casual dismissal of last night suddenly took on a dangerous hue. She had assumed he was just another guest, maybe a musician passing through, irrelevant in this room of suits and titles. She had been wrong, disastrously wrong. Phone calls began. Assistant after assistant delivered the same message. Ozzy Osbourne's reach was massive. His network was influential, and he had noticed her behavior. Panic began to creep in, subtle at first, then unmistakable. She rehearsed what she would say if he requested a meeting, if he mentioned her hesitation publicly, if anyone brought up the snub. The confidence she wore like armor the night before now felt brittle and ill-fitting. Meanwhile, in the corner of her office, a silent observer might have smiled. Not out of glee, but out of quiet understanding. Ozzy's power wasn't in retaliation or ego. It was in observation, patience, and quiet authority. He didn't need to speak loudly to change the game. He just needed to exist in the room. By afternoon, the first direct approach came. An email from Ozzy's assistant, simple and professional. MSCO name, Mr. Osbourne would be available for a brief meeting at your convenience. Her stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed to ignore it, to delay, to assert control. But she knew instinctively that delaying now would only make her appear dismissive again. And the whispers from yesterday were not whispers anymore. The ripple of her behavior had reached ears she could not control. She sent a quick, hurried reply. Yes, we can meet. Please schedule at your earliest convenience. Her hands trembled slightly. She felt a mixture of fear, anticipation, and regret. How could she have misjudged someone so completely? How could she have allowed pride to blind her for even a moment? By evening, her team was in overdrive. Talking points, background research, notes on corporate partnerships, all prepared to salvage the situation. Every person around her knew the stakes. One misstep, and the snub that had seemed minor yesterday could become a headline tomorrow. In the meantime, Ozzy remained unhurried, calm, composed, almost casual. He didn't send a single threatening word, didn't demand attention, didn't gloat. Yet his presence, the quiet authority he exuded, weighed heavily on the room. The CEO realized something crucial. She had been outmaneuvered without even realizing it. Power wasn't about loud declarations, sharp suits, or rehearsed speeches. Power sometimes was quiet, observant, patient, and capable of turning arrogance into vulnerability in the span of a single moment. By the end of the day, the CEO knew it. She had miscalculated the most influential person in the room. And now she was fully aware that the tables had turned. Tomorrow, she would have to face him. And for the first time in a long time, she felt uncertain about the outcome. Because in this game, subtlety was more powerful than ego. and she had just been schooled by a man who didn't even need to raise his voice. What's worse, being confident in wrong, or humble in right?
This is a major complication.
How do we resolve it? Relax. I've handled this before.
The next morning, the CEO awoke with a single thought looping in her mind. I need that meeting. Her usual confidence felt hollow. The realization of what she had done, ignoring Ozzy Osbourne's outstretched hand, had settled like a weight in her chest. She understood now that this wasn't just a snub. It was a miscalculation with consequences, and she could feel the subtle shift in the corporate network. People had noticed, and whispers of her oversight were already circulating. By mid-morning, her assistant handed her a stack of messages from Ozzy's team. Each one was polite, professional, but firm. The subtext was unmistakable. Time was a commodity, and Ozzy's attention wasn't guaranteed. She reread the first message several times. MS CEO name, Mr. Osbourne is available for a brief discussion at your convenience. Please confirm a time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Pride screamed to stall, to assert that she was busy, that she deserved his attention. But reality won. She typed a quick response. Yes, please schedule at your earliest convenience. Thank you. Her heart raced. Every word felt like walking a tightrope. She knew one misstep now could undo everything. Appear desperate, appear arrogant, appear foolish. She needed finesse and humility, something she rarely practiced in boardrooms. By afternoon, her team was in a flurry. Background notes on Ozzy's ventures, briefings on cultural impact, dossiers on past collaborations. Every possible preparation for the meeting had to be precise. She couldn't allow herself to walk in underprepared. The last thing she could afford was to repeat last night's mistake. Meanwhile, in the lobby of the office where the meeting was scheduled, Ozzy arrived with the same calm presence he had shown at the gala. No entourage, no dramatic entrance, just a quiet, self-assured stride. His demeanor radiated authority not through intimidation, but through composure and observation. The CEO waited, pacing subtly, rehearsing phrases she might use. She had practiced charm, eloquence, and flattery, but the nagging awareness of her previous error made every word feel fragile. When the meeting finally began, she extended her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. The gesture was professional, respectful, even earnest. Ozzy accepted it calmly. No smirk, no pause, just a firm, polite handshake. The difference was palpable. The room's energy shifted again, but this time in his favor. He didn't need to assert dominance. Her acknowledgement was enough. The conversation proceeded. The CEO tried to steer it with her usual strategies, influence, metrics, projections, but Ozzy listened patiently, occasionally interjecting insightful points that revealed both his understanding of business and cultural nuance. Every statement was measured, deliberate. He didn't lecture, didn't mock, didn't boast. He simply existed as a figure whose weight in the room couldn't be ignored. By the end of the discussion, the CEO realized something profound. She hadn't regained control. Instead, she had learned a lesson in quiet authority, respect, and the cost of underestimating someone who didn't need to perform to command attention. As Ozzy departed, the CEO sat back, humbled. She had begged for a meeting, but she had gained more than just a chance to speak. She had gained perspective. And in that realization, she knew this. True power doesn't demand recognition. It quietly commands it. The message was clear. And the boardroom, and the corporate world watching from the sidelines, would remember exactly how it had unfolded. The days following the meeting spread like wildfire across social media. Industry insiders, journalists, and gossip pages picked up the story. A high-powered CEO had snubbed Ozzy Osbourne, only to realize her mistake the very next day. Headlines didn't exaggerate. The facts alone were compelling. CEO humiliated by Ozzy Osbourne's snub, now begging for meeting. Rock legend quietly schools corporate power. Respect before ego. Lessons from Ozzy Osbourne. Every post carried the same subtle moral. Authority doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room. Power isn't about entitlement or titles. Sometimes it's about restraint, observation, and letting actions speak louder than words. The CEO, once untouchable in her circles, now faced whispers and subtle reminders wherever she went. Colleagues who had previously deferred to her influence now referenced the incident in private discussions, not to mock, but to reflect. She had misjudged someone based on appearance, underestimating the quiet weight of reputation, experience, and character. Meanwhile, Ozzy Osbourne's calm demeanor became the defining aspect of the story. He didn't publicly humiliate the CEO, didn't gloat, didn't leverage her mistake for personal gain. He simply remained composed, letting the narrative unfold naturally. His restraint amplified the lesson, creating a stark contrast to the arrogance he had faced. Public reaction was overwhelming. Fans applauded his professionalism. Executives shared the story as a cautionary tale. Never underestimate someone who carries influence quietly. Even media outlets emphasized the dignity in his response. Not revenge, not confrontation, just poise and awareness. Analysts weighed in, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. Social media users debated leadership styles, humility in corporate culture, and the invisible currency of respect. Memes circulated, not cruelly, but as reminders. A single handshake can define a reputation. Through it all, Ozzy Osbourne remained unchanged. Invitations continued to pour in for collaborations, interviews, and partnerships. He accepted selectively, on his own terms, quietly reinforcing the lesson he had demonstrated. Presence and integrity matter more than titles and theatrics. For the CEO, the incident became a turning point. She realized that influence isn't just about who dominates a conversation or who commands attention first. Real authority comes from respecting others, recognizing merit, and exercising judgment without bias. Her misstep, though embarrassing, offered a rare opportunity for reflection, and the humbling experience was seared into the corporate memory as a permanent lesson. By the end of the week, the story had reached millions online. Comments poured in, praising Ozzy's restraint and humility. This is why true legends don't need to prove themselves. Respect isn't optional. It's everything. Power doesn't shout, it observes. For viewers and professionals alike, the takeaway was clear. Arrogance can blind, but patience, dignity, and quiet authority endure. One small action, a refusal to engage in prideful games, had made a far greater impact than any confrontation could have. Ozzy's message resonated beyond music and business. It was a lesson in humility, respect, and the quiet power of composure. And as the CEO moved forward, the memory of that handshake and what it represented became a guiding principle. Never underestimate the power of character over ego. In the end, the story wasn't about victory or revenge. It was about integrity, observation, and the enduring truth that quiet strength often speaks louder than any title, suit, or performance in the room. If you believe respect should come before status, type respect in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that inspire.